My name is Bob Kessler, and this story happened to me and my family back in the fall of 1979. It's been years since that terrible week at Mount Shasta, but even now I still have nightmares about it. If you're hearing this, consider it a warning. There are places in this world where you're not welcome, and sometimes the land itself fights back. It started when my wife Catherine, our son Tim, and I decided to take a little family trip. We'd just bought an old RV, a 1976 Winnebago Brave. It wasn't in perfect shape, but it was good enough. Catherine had always loved nature, and Tim was a teenager, 16 years old, full of attitude, and glued to his camera. He wasn't thrilled about going on a family bonding trip, but he came along anyway, probably because we didn't give him much of a choice. We reached the Mount Shasta campground late one evening in October. The air was crisp, and the golden leaves from the fall trees crunched under our boots as we walked around to stretch after the long drive. It was beautiful, more peaceful than I'd expected. Catherine was excited, rattling off the names of trees and plants she recognized, and Tim wandered off with his camera like usual, snapping pictures of the scenery without saying much. That first night, though, something felt off. As we sat around the small campfire, Catherine pointed out some carvings on the trees nearby. "Look at that," she said, squinting in the fading light. I followed her gaze and noticed what she meant: strange symbols etched into the bark. They looked ancient, maybe some kind of Native American markings. I didn't think much of it at first, just part of the mountain's history, I guessed. But Tim was curious. He wandered off a little farther and came back holding something. "Check this out," he said, tossing a carved object onto the picnic table in front of us. It was a small wooden totem, weathered by age and cracked in places. The carvings on it matched the ones on the trees, but there was something unsettling about it. "Where'd you find that?" I asked. "Just over there," Tim replied, waving toward the edge of the forest. "There were a bunch of them hanging from the trees." "Put it back," Catherine said quickly. Her voice was calm but firm, the way she spoke when she wasn't messing around. Tim rolled his eyes but didn't argue. He trudged back to return the totem while muttering something under his breath about how we were too superstitious. That night, strange things started happening. I was the first to hear it. Laughter. It floated through the air, faint and distant, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. It sounded like children giggling, but there weren't any kids at the campground. I got up to check outside, shining a flashlight around, but there was nothing there except the trees swaying in the cold wind. When I climbed back into the RV, Catherine was awake too. "Did you hear it?" she whispered. I nodded, not wanting to wake Tim, who was snoring loudly in the back. "Probably the wind," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her, but deep down, I didn't believe it. The next morning, things only got weirder. When I stepped outside with my coffee, Catherine was standing by the RV, staring at the ground near the tires. "Do you see this?" she asked, pointing. I bent down to look. A strange sticky red moss was creeping up from the dirt and clinging to the rubber. I'd never seen anything like it before. It didn't look natural. It gave me the creeps. But Catherine, always the botanist, grabbed a small sample and tucked it into a jar. Tim wandered back from his solo morning hike later, looking unusually excited. "You won't believe what I found out there," he said, holding up his camera. He showed us a few of the shots he'd taken, and one jumped out at me right away. A photo of large, deep footprints in the dirt. They were huge, much bigger than any human tracks I'd ever seen. But that wasn't the strangest part. Each footprint had 6 distinct toes. "Pranksters," I said, brushing it off. "Probably some kids messing around. It's just a joke." Tim just shrugged, but I could tell he didn't really believe me. To be honest, I wasn't so sure either. By the time night fell again, the unease that had started the first night was back, stronger than before. It wasn't just the weird sounds or the strange red moss, it was the silence. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no chirping crickets. It felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath, waiting. And then, just as we were settling in for the night, the laughter came back. This time, it was louder, closer. It didn't sound like children anymore. It sounded wrong, twisted, like someone trying to imitate a child but failing. My pulse raced as I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside again. But when I swung the beam of light around, the forest was empty, just dark trees staring back at me like silent watchers. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. "We're packing up tomorrow," I told Catherine. She didn't argue. But little did I know, leaving wasn't going to be that easy. The next morning the uneasiness was still there. It clung to the air like mist, heavy and unavoidable. I woke up early, hoping to get a head start on packing so we could leave. But as soon as I stepped outside the RV, I noticed something wasn't right. The red moss from the night before had spread. It wasn't just on the tires anymore. It was creeping up the RV's exterior like some kind of slimy vine. The stuff gave me the chills. I grabbed a wrench from the toolbox and tried scraping some of it off. But it didn't budge. It was sticky, like glue. And no matter how hard I scrubbed at it, the moss seemed to almost cling tighter. Catherine came out, her arms crossed against the cold, and stared at the scene. That's not normal, Bob," she said softly, "even for moss. This isn't normal." She was right. But I didn't want to admit it. "Let's just focus on packing," I mumbled, brushing it off. I didn't tell her that deep down. I was starting to feel like this trip might have been a mistake. While Catherine and I sorted things out, Tim wandered off again with his camera. I didn't like him going off alone, especially after the strange laughter the night before. But you try stopping a stubborn 16-year-old. He promised not to go far. So I let him go, even though every instinct in me screamed to keep him close. A few hours later, back at the RV, we had an unexpected visitor. One of the local park rangers, Jackson Wells. He was an older guy, maybe in his mid-50s, with a weather-beaten face and eyes that seemed to hold a lot of stories. He tipped his hat when he approached, standing just outside the RV, like he didn't want to get too close. "Morning," he said in a gruff voice. "You folks new to the area, just passing through," I said, trying to sound casual. "We're actually packing up to leave." Ranger Wells didn't seem too convinced. He took a moment to look around, his gaze lingering on the red moss before landing back on me. "You've picked an interesting time to camp here," he said, almost like a warning. "What do you mean?" Catherine asked, stepping forward. The ranger scratched the back of his neck, like he was trying to figure out the best way to say what was on his mind. Finally, he spoke. "We've had some strange things happen around these parts lately. A few folks have gone missing. No sign of where they went or why, and..." He hesitated, glancing at the woods. "If I were you, I'd pack up sooner rather than later." I didn't know what to say. Missing people, that wasn't exactly comforting. Catherine looked concerned, but she didn't press him for details. Tim, of course, showed up just in time to hear the last part of the conversation. "Missing people? Like what? They just vanished?" Tim asked, his voice laced with curiosity. "Something like that," the ranger replied. He looked at Tim's camera and added, "Stay safe, kid. Sometimes curiosity can get you into trouble." With that, he tipped his hat again and left, disappearing down the trail. I watched him go, a strange sense of unease settling over me. I wasn't sure what Ranger Wells knew, but it was clear he wasn't telling us the whole story. That night, things got worse. Tim showed us some new photos he'd taken during his hike, and one of them stopped me cold. It was a picture of footprints again, more of those massive six-toed tracks, but this time they were fresh. The detail in the photo made it clear that whatever left those prints was heavy. Mud and pine needles had been pushed deep into the ground. "What made these?" Tim asked, his voice quieter than usual. He was genuinely spooked, though he tried to act like he wasn't. "I don't know. I said honestly, but I don't think it's something we want to run into. That night, as we tried to settle in, the RV felt colder than before. Catherine checked the little thermostat inside, and her brow furrowed. The temperature outside hadn't dropped that much, but inside the RV, it felt like winter. We huddled in our blankets, but the chill seemed to seep right through them. Even Rex, our dog, was acting strange. He wouldn't stop pacing, his ears twitching like he could hear something we couldn't. Around midnight, the laughter came again. It was unmistakable, louder than before. It was as if the sound had crept right up to the RV, echoing in the darkness outside. Catherine gripped my arm, her face pale, and Tim peeked nervously out from his blanket. Even Rex stopped pacing and stood frozen, his head cocked and fur bristling. "We need to check it out," Tim whispered, but I shook my head. "No, stay inside," I said firmly. My voice was shaking a little. I didn't care how brave Tim wanted to act. There was no way I was letting him or anyone else step out into that darkness. The laughter eventually stopped, but none of us could sleep after that. Every little creak of the RV felt like a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. By morning we were exhausted, our nerves frayed, and then Catherine noticed something that made my stomach drop. The plants she kept in little pots by the RV windows, her pride and joy, were dead. All of them. They'd been perfectly healthy the day before, but now they were wilted and brown, like they'd been frozen solid. Catherine was devastated, but I could see the fear in her eyes as she tried to figure out what had happened. This wasn't normal. None of it was. I decided then and there that as soon as we could get everything packed, we were leaving. Whatever was out there in the woods, whatever was causing the moss, the laughter, the footprints, it wasn't something I wanted to mess with. But what I didn't realize was that leaving wasn't going to be as simple as I thought, because the worst was still to come. By the 5th day, I wasn't just uneasy anymore. I was scared. We had tried to leave that morning, but as soon as I turned the key in the RV's ignition, nothing happened. Dead. The engine didn't even sputter. It was just lifeless. I checked the battery, checked the fuel lines. Everything looked fine, but it wouldn't start. Catherine stood outside, arms wrapped tightly around herself, looking toward the woods. "It feels like this place doesn't want us to leave," she murmured. Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't let my fear show. I couldn't. I had to be the strong one, even though my hands were shaking as I closed the hood of the RV. "It's probably just some old wiring," I said, trying to sound calm. "We'll figure it out." But the truth was, I didn't believe my own words. Tim, on the other hand, didn't seem as scared as he should have been. He was excited, curious, too curious for his own good. That's the thing about being 16. You don't think anything can really hurt you. "I think we should check out the cave," he said suddenly. "What cave?" I asked, confused. Tim held up his camera. "I found it yesterday when I was hiking. There was like a weird trail leading to this little opening in the rocks. It didn't go in too deep, but there were these markings inside, kind of like the ones on the trees." "No," I said firmly. "You're not going back there." "But Dad," I said. "No." My voice was sharper than I intended, and Tim scowled, but he didn't push it. Catherine gave me a worried look, but she didn't say anything. She knew I wasn't in the mood to argue. That evening, our dog Rex started acting even stranger. He wouldn't stop growling, his eyes fixed on something outside the RV. At first I thought maybe he'd spotted a raccoon or a deer, but when I stepped out to look, there was nothing there, just the forest, dark and endless, stretching out in every direction. "Rex, come on," I muttered, tugging at his collar, but he wouldn't budge. His growls turned into high-pitched whines as he backed up, tail tucked between his legs. And that's when I saw it. Just for a split second, something moved in the shadows. It was quick, barely more than a blur, but it was there. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped back toward the RV, pulling Rex along with me. I didn't know what I'd seen. An animal, maybe, or just my imagination playing tricks on me. But whatever it was, it didn't feel right. That night, the temperature dropped again. It was so cold inside the RV that I could see my own breath. Catherine and Tim were bundled up in blankets, huddled close for warmth, but even that didn't seem to help. Rex had curled into a tight ball at our feet, trembling, and then, just before dawn, he disappeared. I woke up to the sound of scratching at the door. For a second, I thought it was Rex trying to get back inside, but when I opened the door, he wasn't there. "Rex," I called out, stepping onto the frozen ground. My voice echoed in the stillness, but there was no answer. I grabbed the flashlight and swept the beam across the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I saw it. A trail of blood. It led from the RV to the edge of the woods, disappearing into the trees. My stomach turned, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Rex was more than just a pet. He was family, but deep down, I already knew I wasn't going to find him alive. "Bob, what's going on?" Catherine whispered from the doorway. Tim stood behind her, looking pale and frightened. I didn't want to scare them, but there was no way to sugarcoat it. "Rex is gone," I said quietly. "Stay inside." Locked the door. I followed the blood trail as far as I could, keeping my flashlight steady and my steps quiet. The forest felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet, like the trees were holding their breath. I thought about that cave Tim had mentioned, and sure enough, the blood trail led straight to it. The entrance was small, just big enough to crouch through. I hesitated, shining the flashlight inside. The beam caught on something glinting in the darkness, and my breath hitched. It was Rex's collar, but the sight that made my blood run cold was what lay beside it, a torn piece of brown fabric. It looked like part of a uniform, a ranger's uniform. "Ranger Wells," I muttered under my breath. I didn't go any farther. Something about that cave, it felt like stepping into a trap, like whatever was waiting inside wanted me to follow. I turned and hurried back to the RV, trying to keep my panic in check. When I got back, Catherine was waiting for me, her face pale and drawn. "Bob," she said, her voice trembling, "there's something you need to see." She led me around to the side of the RV, where strange symbols had been carved into the metal overnight. They matched the ones we'd seen on the trees, sharp and jagged, like they'd been done with claws instead of tools. "What does it mean?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, but I had a sick feeling that we were being marked, targeted, somehow. That night, Tim started sleepwalking. I woke up to the sound of the RV door creaking open and bolted upright. Tim was gone. "Catherine, stay here," I said, grabbing the flashlight and rushing outside. Tim was a few yards away, his face blank, his steps slow and deliberate, like he was in a trance. "Tim," I shouted, running to him. He didn't respond, didn't even look at me. He was heading straight for the woods. I grabbed his shoulder and shook him hard. "Tim, wake up." He blinked, his eyes suddenly focused, and looked at me like he had no idea where he was. "Dad, what's going on? You tell me," I said, my voice shaking. "You were sleepwalking." Tim looked at the dark forest, then back at me. "I don't remember. We went back to the RV, but none of us slept after that." The feeling of being watched had grown stronger, and I knew one thing for certain: whatever was out there wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. The morning of the 7th day felt different. The air seemed heavier, colder, and it was harder to breathe. It wasn't just the frost coating the trees or the gray clouds hanging low in the sky. No, this was something else, something I couldn't explain. When I stepped outside the RV, I saw the frost had spread. It covered the ground in a thick, unnatural layer of ice, even though it wasn't cold enough for it. Trees were frozen solid, their branches encased in ice like glass. It didn't make any sense. Tim and Catherine joined me, both wrapped in blankets. Tim looked uneasy, for the first time showing no sign of his usual rebellious streak. "This isn't normal, Dad," he said quietly. staring at the icy trees. "I know," I replied. "Stay close to me today, both of you." As we stood there, trying to make sense of the frozen landscape, Catherine noticed something near the edge of the woods. She pointed, her hand trembling. "Look," she whispered. At first I didn't see it, but then, as my eyes focused, I noticed strange shapes carved into the frozen bark of the trees. They weren't scratches, they were deliberate symbols, the same ones we'd seen before on the RV and the totems. But now they seemed deeper, darker, as if they were etched by something with claws sharp enough to cut through ice. "I need to check something," Catherine said suddenly. "Check what?" I asked, confused. She held up an old leather-bound journal we'd found inside the RV when we'd first bought it. This was stuffed under the sink. I thought it was just junk, but I glanced through it last night. "And Bob, there's something you should know." She flipped through the pages quickly, stopping at one that was filled with rough sketches and frantic writing. "The person who owned this RV before us, he wrote about Mount Shasta. He said he saw things here, heard things. He mentioned the symbols, and something about a creature that hunts in the ice." "A creature?" Tim asked, his voice shaking. Catherine nodded, her face pale. "He called it a Wendigo." The word didn't mean much to me, but Catherine explained. "It's an old Native American legend, a creature that's connected to hunger and cold. It's like pure evil, Bob. The journal says it can mimic voices, control people's minds and..." She hesitated, glancing at Tim before finishing. "It feeds on humans." My chest tightened, and I looked down at the journal. The sketches showed a tall skeletal creature, with glowing hollow eyes and clawed hands. It looked like something out of a nightmare. "This can't be real," I said, shaking my head. "Doesn't this feel real enough to you?" Catherine replied, motioning to the frozen forest around us. Before I could respond, Tim let out a horrified gasp. "There's someone out there," he shouted, pointing toward the woods. I turned, my heart racing, and saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. It looked like Ranger Wells, but something wasn't right. His uniform was torn, his face pale and lifeless. He just stood there, as still as a statue, staring at us, and then he smiled. "Ranger Wells," I called out, though my voice didn't sound like my own. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one arm and pointed toward the RV. Slowly it began to move forward. Its steps were strange, jerky, like it didn't quite know how to walk. "Get inside," I shouted, pulling Catherine and Tim toward the RV. We scrambled inside and slammed the door shut, locking it. Tim peeked out the window, his breath fogging up the glass. "He's gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but I knew better than to believe that. The rest of the day was tense. We stayed inside the RV, too scared to go out again. Catherine kept reading through the journal, trying to find anything that might help us. Meanwhile, Tim grew more withdrawn. He sat in the corner with his camera, flipping through the photos he'd taken over the past few days. "Something's wrong with these," he muttered at one point. "What do you mean?" I asked, moving to sit beside him. He showed me a photo he'd taken of the forest. At first glance, it looked normal, just trees and shadows. But as I leaned in closer, I noticed a pale figure hiding in the background, almost blending with the ice-covered trees. "You didn't see this when you took the picture?" I asked, my voice tight. Tim shook his head. "I swear it wasn't there before." By nightfall, things took an even darker turn. The laughter came back, but this time it was louder, clearer. It wasn't a child's laughter anymore. It was deep and guttural, echoing around the RV like it was coming from every direction at once. And then we heard the knocking. 3 sharp knocks on the side of the RV, followed by silence. Then 3 more, louder this time. "It's trying to get in," Catherine whispered, clutching her journal tightly. Tim was shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" he asked. "We stay quiet," I said, though my voice betrayed the fact that I didn't have a clue. The knocks continued for what felt like hours, slowly circling the RV. No matter where it came from, I wouldn't look out the window. Something in my gut told me that if I did, I'd regret it. Finally, the knocking stopped, and the night grew still. But the silence was worse than the sound. It felt like something was waiting, just beyond the walls of the RV, ready to strike. And then Tim's eyes glazed over. "Tim," Catherine called softly. He didn't answer. He just stood up, his movements stiff, and walked toward the door. "Tim, no," I shouted, grabbing him. He struggled against me, his face blank, his body cold to the touch. "He's not himself," Catherine screamed. It took both of us to hold him back, and even then, it was like he had the strength of 10 men. I shouted his name over and over again, desperate to bring him back. Finally, his body went limp, and he collapsed into my arms, gasping for air. "Dad," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I couldn't stop. It was like something was pulling me. I held him close, my heart breaking, and looked at Catherine. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with terror. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just outside anymore. It was getting inside of us. Night fell quickly, and with it came an unbearable silence. No wind, no creaks from the trees, not even a distant animal call. It was as if the entire forest had frozen, waiting for something to happen. The temperature inside the RV dropped even lower, turning our breaths into small clouds that hung in the dim air. Tim hadn't spoken much since his sleepwalking episode. He sat by the window now, wrapped in a blanket, staring out into the darkness. Catherine sat in the corner, flipping through the journal over and over, as though she'd find some new clue hidden in the worn pages. I was pacing the small space, trying to think of a plan. We couldn't stay here anymore. The RV wasn't safe. And even if we could get the engine running, I wasn't sure we'd make it far. Whatever was out there, whatever had marked us, it wanted us to stay. The laughter started again, just after midnight. It didn't come from one place this time. It was everywhere. Circling, echoing, and worse, it didn't sound human anymore. There was a strange guttural edge to it, like someone gargling and choking at the same time. Tim flinched and turned to me. "Dad, it's calling me." His voice was so quiet, I almost didn't hear him. "What do you mean?" I asked, kneeling in front of him. "It's in my head," he whispered, tears brimming in his eyes. "It's showing me things, telling me to come outside." I grabbed his shoulders and shook him gently. "You listen to me, Tim. That thing, whatever it is, it's not real. It's trying to trick you. You stay in here, no matter what." He nodded, but I could see he was struggling to hold on. His body kept twitching, like something was trying to make him move. Then we heard it, a loud thud, on the roof. Catherine gasped, dropping the journal, and Tim jumped back from the window. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. Whatever it was heavy, too heavy to be an animal. It shifted above us, the sound of claws scraping against the metal sending shivers down my spine. I picked up the wrench I'd left on the counter, gripping it tightly. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. "Stay here," I whispered to Catherine and Tim. "Don't open that door, unless it's me." "Bob." "No," Catherine said, grabbing my arm. Her hand was icy, trembling. "You can't." "I have to," I said firmly. I looked at her, and then at Tim. "I'm not going to let it take us." Before she could argue, I stepped outside, wrench in hand. The air hit me like a wall of ice, but it wasn't just the cold that made me shiver. It was the weight of the darkness, the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I shone my flashlight on the roof, and my chest tightened. There it was, the creature from the journal. It was hunched over, its skeletal body, too tall and too thin to be human. Its skin was pale, and stretched tight over its bones. like it hadn't eaten in centuries. Frost clung to its hollow, glowing eyes, and its long clawed hands scratched slowly at the roof of the RV. When it turned its head to look at me, my whole body froze. Its mouth twisted into a grin, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. And then, in a voice that wasn't its own, it whispered, "Bob." My legs nearly gave out. It was mimicking my voice, perfectly, but the sound was warped, like it had been dragged through ice. "You're not taking my family," I said through gritted teeth, though my voice shook. The Wendigo tilted its head, as if amused, and leapt down from the roof with a horrifying speed. It landed in front of me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Its presence was overwhelming, like the cold was seeping into my very soul. It lunged. I swung the wrench with everything I had. It connected, and the creature let out an ear-piercing screech that made my ears ring. Black, frost-covered liquid sprayed from the gash I'd made in its arm, but it didn't slow down. It came at me again, faster this time, its claws slicing through the air. I ducked and scrambled toward the RV door, shouting for Catherine and Tim to stay inside. But before I could reach it, the creature grabbed my leg, its icy claws cutting through my jeans like paper. I screamed as pain shot through me, but I didn't stop fighting. I twisted around and slammed the wrench into its face. The creature recoiled, shrieking, and I used the moment to pull myself free and crawl back into the RV. "Close it," I yelled, and Catherine slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as she could. The creature didn't stop. It threw itself against the door, over and over, shaking the entire RV. Tim was crying now, holding his head in his hands as the Wendigo's voice echoed inside his mind. "Decep, Tim, come outside, come to me." I grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him gently but firmly. "Look at me, Tim. Don't listen to it. You're stronger than it. Do you hear me?" Tears streamed down his face, but he nodded. Then it stopped. The banging, the voices, it was silent again. "Is it gone?" Catherine whispered. "No," I said. "It's waiting." The temperature inside dropped even more, frost forming on the walls of the RV. I could see my family's breath, hear their quiet, panicked breathing, and then the windows began to crack. "It's trying to get in," Catherine said, gripping my arm. I realized we didn't have much time. "Take Tim and get out the back," I told her. "What? No, Bob, go," I snapped, my voice rough with fear. "Get to the road, find help, I'll hold it off." She hesitated, her eyes scanning my face, then nodded. She grabbed Tim's hand, and they slipped out the back, into the freezing dark. The Wendigo must have sensed their movement, because it let out another awful screech and smashed through the front window. I turned to face it, raising my wrench again. This was it. The battle inside the RV was chaos. It came at me with a speed and strength that didn't seem possible, but I fought back with everything I had. I aimed for its head, its chest, anything that looked vulnerable. The frostbite on my hand spread quickly, burning and numbing me at the same time, but I didn't stop. Finally, as it lunged one last time, I grabbed a propane canister from under the sink and shoved it into its path. When it hit the ground, I swung the wrench down hard, aiming for the valve. The canister erupted, flames and heat bursting through the cramped space. The Wendigo screamed, its icy body melting and burning in the fire. I threw myself out of the RV, landing in the snow just as the flames consumed the vehicle. I found Catherine and Tim hours later, shivering but alive on the side of the road. We hugged tightly, crying and shaking, barely able to speak. To this day, I don't know if I killed it. I don't know if it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. But I do know one thing: we'll never go back to Mount Shasta again. My name is Michael Eastwood, but most people just call me Mike. This happened to me about 7 years ago, though. I'll never forget a single moment of it. I've worked in forests my whole life, first with the Forest Service, and now as a wildlife researcher. I thought I knew everything there was to know about the woods, but nothing could have prepared me for what I faced in those redwoods of Northern California. It started when I got a call from Diane Henderson, a cultural anthropologist I'd worked with on a couple of projects in the past. She told me she needed my help. There'd been reports of strange activity deep in the forests of Humboldt County, stories of Bigfoot sightings, eerie noises, and bizarre carvings in trees. Diane was convinced it could be tied to Native American legends, and she wanted to investigate. I wasn't a Bigfoot believer, but the idea of heading out into the wilderness for some research sounded like a good excuse to get away from the chaos of everyday life. So I said yes. We drove out in my old RV, a 1981 Airstream Exceller I'd modified for off-grid research. It had everything we needed: specialized radio equipment for tracking wildlife, survival gear, and enough food for a couple of weeks. Diane had also packed her own equipment: cameras, notebooks, and books on local tribal history. When we got to the logging roads, we had to leave the main highway behind. The forest swallowed us up almost immediately. No phone service, no signs of other people, just endless trees and the hum of my RV's engine. The first thing we noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, it was unnerving. No birds, no crickets, nothing, just the sound of the wind moving through the redwoods. Diane said it could be natural, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. I don't think either of us wanted to admit how creepy it felt. We set up camp by a clearing, not far from a small creek. The redwoods towered overhead, their massive trunks blotting out most of the sky. That first day was uneventful. We unloaded our gear, checked our radios, and made plans for the week. Diane was excited, talking about the carvings rumored to be deep in the forest and how they might connect to guardian spirit legends from local tribes. I tried to focus on my tracking equipment, making sure everything was in working order, but her excitement was contagious. That night, things started getting strange. It was just after midnight when I woke up to this deep thrumming sound. It wasn't loud exactly, more like a vibration that I could feel in my chest. It came and went in waves, like something humming far away but powerful enough to reach us. I thought maybe it was some kind of machinery, logging equipment or something, but it didn't sound right for that. Diane heard it too. She sat up, clutching her notebook like it was a lifeline. Infrasound, she whispered. It's used to make people feel uneasy, to keep them away. I had no idea what she meant, but the look on her face told me she wasn't just guessing. The next morning, we decided to explore the area. That's when we found the tree carvings. They weren't just crude scratches, they were intricate, almost like symbols, carved deep into the bark of several massive redwoods. Some looked like faces, others like swirling patterns. Diane was practically buzzing with excitement, snapping photos and sketching them in her notebook. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. The woods felt different, heavier, somehow. Then we stumbled onto something that stopped us both in our tracks: an abandoned campsite. The tent was torn open, its fabric flapping in the breeze. Supplies were scattered everywhere: pots, a sleeping bag, a half-eaten can of food. Diane found a notebook lying in the dirt and flipped through the pages. Maria Ramirez, she muttered, reading the name scribbled inside. She was a grad student researching this area. There were notes about the carvings, the legends, even sightings of strange lights in the trees. The last entry was short and hurried. Something is out here, watching me. Don't feel safe. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whoever Maria was, she was gone now. And by the looks of her camp, she hadn't left willingly. That's when we heard the crunch of branches behind us. We spun around to see a man standing at the edge of the clearing. He looked like he belonged out here. Worn flannel shirt, boots caked in mud, and a weathered face that told me he'd seen his fair share of hard work. Didn't mean to scare you, he said in a gruff voice. Name's Lucas. I'm a logger. He stepped closer, and I noticed the way his eyes darted between me and Diane, like he was sizing us up. Lucas said he'd been working in the area for years and offered to show us some old logging trails. Diane seemed eager to accept his help, but something about him put me on edge. I couldn't tell if it was the way he smiled just a little too wide, or the fact that he seemed to know more than he was letting on. As the sun started to set, we headed back to the RV. That night, the humming sound returned, louder this time. The whole RV seemed to vibrate with it. Diane wanted to stay up and record it, but I told her we needed rest. We had no idea what we were dealing with, and we'd need all the strength we could muster. Looking back, I should have trusted my instincts. I should have left right then and there. But curiosity, it's a dangerous thing, and in those redwoods, curiosity could get you killed. The next morning, the forest felt different. Still quiet, but now there was this strange energy in the air, like the trees were holding their breath. Diane and I decided to check out the trails Lucas had mentioned. He said there was a spot deeper in the woods where people had reported seeing footprints, huge ones. Diane was excited. Me, not so much. We followed a faint trail that twisted through the dense redwoods. The shadows stretched long across the forest floor, and the only sounds were our own footsteps. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, convinced I'd heard something, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, but there was nothing. Diane kept glancing at her notebook, her face lit up with curiosity, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After about an hour of hiking, we found them. The footprints, they were massive, easily twice the size of my boot, and they weren't just random, they were in a pattern, almost like a circle. Diane knelt down, running her hand across the edges of the prints. These aren't human, she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and excitement. She snapped some pictures and jotted down notes, but I just stood there staring at them. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I couldn't explain it, but something about those prints felt wrong. They didn't belong here. As we followed the trail of footprints, we started noticing other things too. Small piles of dead animals, birds, squirrels, even a fox, all arranged in strange formations. Diane thought it might be some kind of ritual, but I didn't want to think about what that could mean. The smell was awful, and the air felt heavy, like it was harder to breathe. That night, back at the RV, we tried to make sense of everything. Diane was flipping through her notes, muttering about guardian spirits and ancient rituals, while I checked the recordings from our radio equipment. That's when I noticed something strange. The radio had picked up a series of low-frequency sounds, almost like a heartbeat, but deeper. It wasn't a pattern I recognized, and it definitely wasn't natural. As the night went on, the forest came alive in the worst way. It started with the lights. At first, they were faint, little glimmers between the trees, like fireflies, but fireflies don't move like that, and they certainly don't glow blue. Diane grabbed her camera, but every time she tried to snap a picture, the lights would vanish. "They're watching us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't respond. I was too busy staring at the trees, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Then the vibrations started again. This time they were stronger. The whole RV seemed to hum, the metal walls shivering like they were alive. I ran outside, thinking maybe it was an earthquake, but the ground wasn't moving. The trees, though, they were swaying, even though there was no wind. Their massive trunks creaked and groaned, and for a second, I thought I saw one of them twist, like it was turning to look at me. I backed into the RV, slamming the door behind me. Diane was already packing up her equipment, her hands shaking. "Something's out there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something old." That night, neither of us slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear the distant thrum of infrasound, or catch a glimpse of those blue lights flickering through the trees. By the time the sun rose, I felt like I'd been awake for years. Diane wasn't much better. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. But the worst part, when we stepped outside that morning, we saw the RV. The aluminum exterior, which I'd polished not long ago, was covered in rust. It didn't make sense. Rust doesn't just appear overnight, and it definitely doesn't spread the way this had. The edges of the metal seemed to flake and crumble when I touched them, like the forest itself was trying to swallow the RV. Diane pointed out something else too, more carvings, etched into the bark of a tree just outside our camp. They hadn't been there the day before, and they were fresh, the grooves still wet and dark. These carvings were different from the ones we'd found earlier. They weren't symbols, they were warnings. By this point, I was starting to question everything. None of it made sense. The footprints, the vibrations, the lights, the rust on the RV. Diane was determined to figure it all out, but I wasn't so sure we should even be here anymore. Something about the forest felt alive, like it knew we didn't belong. We decided to head back toward the carvings we'd found earlier, hoping they might give us some answers. Diane believed they were tied to local tribal legends, so she spent the morning flipping through her books, looking for anything that matched. I tried to keep watch, scanning the forest for any sign of movement, but the trees were so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. After hiking for what felt like hours, we stumbled upon something I'll never forget. It was a clearing, similar to the one where we'd found the footprints, but this one was different. In the center was a massive stone, covered in moss and strange markings. Around it were scattered bones, not just animal bones, either. Some of them were human. Diane dropped to her knees in front of the stone, brushing away the moss to get a better look at the carvings. "These are ancient," she said, her voice shaky. "They're warnings, Mike. They're trying to keep people away." "From what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled out her notebook, flipping through her sketches and notes. Finally, she pointed to a page filled with rough drawings and text. "Guardian spirits," she said quietly. The local tribes believed the forest was protected by something ancient, something powerful. They didn't call it Bigfoot, but it fits the description. It's not just an animal, it's a guardian, a protector of the land. "A protector doesn't leave piles of dead animals," I said, my voice harsher than I intended. Diane looked up at me, her eyes wide. "Maybe it does, if we're the threat." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd spent years working in forests, watching as trees were cut down and wildlife displaced. I'd always told myself it wasn't my fault, that it was just the way things worked. But standing there, surrounded by those bones and carvings, I couldn't help but feel like we'd done something terrible. We were just about to head back to the RV when we found it, a small ramshackle shrine hidden behind a cluster of trees. At first I thought it was just a pile of sticks and rocks, but as we got closer, I realized it was deliberate. There were candles, long burnt out, and pieces of fabric tied to the branches above. And in the center, a small wooden figure, crudely carved but unmistakably humanoid. "Lucas," I muttered under my breath. Diane looked at me, her face pale. "You think he made this?" I nodded. "It has to be him. He knew too much about this place. Too much about what's out here." We didn't stay long. I didn't like the idea of being near something Lucas might have put together, especially considering how strange he'd been acting. The whole hike back, I kept expecting him to appear out of nowhere, but the forest was silent, eerily so. When we reached the RV, things were even worse than before. The rust had spread across the entire surface, and the metal was starting to crumble around the edges. Diane tried to stay calm, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "It's the forest," she said. "It's trying to scare us, to get us to leave." "Well, it's working," I said, trying to force a smile, but deep down I knew it wasn't going to let us go that easily. That night, the forest came alive again. The lights were brighter now, darting back and forth between the trees like they were searching for something or someone. The vibrations shook the RV so hard that I thought it might collapse, and the carvings outside seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Then we heard it, a deep guttural roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was low and rumbling, almost like the sound of an earthquake, but there was something in it that felt alive. Diane grabbed my arm, her face pale. "It's here," she whispered. "The Guardian." The roar came again, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door, stepping outside, despite every instinct screaming at me not to. The forest was pitch black, but in the distance, I saw movement, something massive, shifting between the trees. I couldn't make out any details, but whatever it was watching us. Diane pulled me back inside, slamming the door shut. "We need to figure out what it wants," she said, her voice trembling. "If the tribes were right, it's not here to hurt us, not unless we've done something to anger it." "And what exactly would that be?" I snapped. "Just being here seems to be enough." She didn't have an answer. As the night wore on, we pieced together what we could from her notes and the carvings we'd seen. The Guardian wasn't just protecting the forest, it was punishing those who violated it. Lucas's shrine, Maria's disappearance, the dead animals, everything started to connect. Whatever Lucas was doing out here, it wasn't just logging, he was trying to summon something. By the time dawn broke, I'd made up my mind. We needed to find Lucas. Whatever was happening out here, he was at the center of it, and if we didn't stop him, I had a feeling none of us were making it out alive. The next day, we set out to find Lucas. I didn't know what I was going to do when we found him, but I knew we couldn't keep waiting for the forest to close in on us. Diane was quiet as we packed up, her usual energy replaced by a nervous stillness. The forest too seemed to hold its breath. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence that felt like it was pressing down on us. We followed the trail toward the clearing, where we'd found Lucas's shrine. The air felt thicker somehow, like there was something in it that didn't belong. Diane kept glancing over her shoulder, and I couldn't blame her. It felt like we weren't alone, like something was walking just out of sight, keeping pace with us. When we reached the shrine again, it was different. The little wooden figure was gone, and the rocks and candles were scattered around as if something or someone had destroyed it. There were fresh footprints in the mud, leading deeper into the forest. Human footprints. They had to be Lucas's. We followed them, even though every instinct I had was telling me to turn back. The trees seemed to close in around us the farther we went, their massive trunks almost pressing together, blocking out the sunlight. The only light came from a strange pale glow that seemed to flicker through the branches, a glow that wasn't natural. I didn't say anything, but I knew Diane saw it too. Her hand tightened on her notebook, and I could see her lips moving, like she was whispering something to herself. Then, we found it. Another clearing, much larger than the first, with a massive stone altar in the center. Around it were several crude wooden totems, their twisted shapes casting long shadows across the ground. The air smelled like decay, and the ground was soft and wet, like it had been soaked in something thick and dark. And there, lying crumpled near one of the totems, was Maria, or what was left of her. Diane let out a gasp, clapping her hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on Maria's lifeless body. Her skin was pale and swollen, her eyes wide open but empty, staring at nothing. Around her were strange markings, carved into the ground like some kind of ritual circle. We didn't have time to react before we heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps. Lucas stepped into the clearing, his face twisted into something I can only describe as madness. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his hands were covered in what looked like blood. He didn't even seem surprised to see us. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, his voice low and rough. "What the hell did you do?" I demanded, stepping forward despite the fear clawing at my chest. "What is this?" Lucas tilted his head, his lips curling into a sick grin. "You don't understand, do you? This forest, it's alive. It always has been, but it needs us, needs a connection, a sacrifice." He gestured toward Maria's body like it was nothing more than a broken tool. She understood. Eventually, Diane stepped forward, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. You killed her. You've been doing this, all of this. The carvings, the shrine, the lights. It's you." Lucas laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "Me? No. I'm just helping. It was here, long before me, and it'll be here, long after. All I've done is show it a little respect." Before either of us could respond, the ground beneath us began to shake. Not a little tremor, but a deep, bone-rattling quake that made it hard to stand. The trees around the clearing groaned and creaked, their branches twisting and reaching like they were alive. "It's too late now," Lucas said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the forest. "It's awake." And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a massive shape, moving between the trees. But as it stepped into the clearing, the pale, flickering light revealed its full form. It was huge, taller than any human could ever be, its body covered in thick, matted fur that seemed to ripple and shimmer like it was part of the forest itself. Its face was almost human but distorted, with glowing amber eyes that seemed to pierce through everything. This was no ordinary creature. This was the Guardian. It let out a roar, the same guttural, earth-shaking sound we'd heard the night before. Lucas dropped to his knees, arms raised like he was welcoming it. Diane grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the tree line, but I couldn't look away. The ground around the creature seemed to come alive, roots and vines snaking their way toward the altar. And then it attacked. The vines wrapped around Lucas, lifting him off the ground like he weighed nothing. For a moment he didn't even struggle. He just smiled, like he'd won. But as the vines tightened, crushing him, his screams filled the air, high and guttural, before they were suddenly cut off. The forest fell silent again, the only sound the creaking of the vines as they dragged his lifeless body toward the Guardian. "Mike, we have to go," Diane whispered, tears streaming down her face. Now I didn't argue. We turned and ran, stumbling through the forest as the ground shifted and twisted beneath us. The lights were everywhere now, darting between the trees, growing brighter. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, crushing us. I could hear the creature's roars in the distance, getting fainter as we ran, but I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. When we finally made it back to the RV, I slammed the door shut and locked it, even though I knew it wouldn't stop anything. Diane was shaking, clutching her notebook, like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I sat down, my chest heaving, trying to catch my breath. But then the RV began to shake. The RV was shaking so hard I thought it might fall to pieces. The lights outside weren't just flickering anymore. They were swirling, spinning faster and faster, until it looked like a storm of glowing blue fireflies had surrounded us. The deep, vibrating hum was back, but now it felt stronger, like it was coming from inside my own chest. Diane and I just sat there, frozen, staring at each other. We didn't say it, but we both knew. The forest wasn't going to let us leave. The roar came again, this time so close that the walls of the RV rattled. I grabbed the flashlight, though I wasn't even sure why. It felt like the smallest, most useless thing against something so big, so ancient. Diane was flipping through her notebook, with shaking hands, muttering things I couldn't make out. Her voice was thin, almost like she was running out of air. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice tight, barely above a whisper. "Looking for a way to stop it," she said, her eyes fixed on the notes she'd taken about the carvings and the petroglyphs. "There's got to be something, some ritual, something to calm it." Calm it, I thought. How do you calm something that can tear apart trees and crush a man like it's nothing? Outside, the roar came again, and this time it was followed by the sound of trees splitting and snapping. I risked a glance out the window, and my stomach twisted. The Guardian was moving toward us, its massive body pushing through the trees like they were nothing more than tall grass. Its amber eyes glowed brighter than before, fixed on the RV like it knew exactly where we were. The ground beneath us started to shift, the vibrations growing stronger. Suddenly, The vines and roots we'd seen earlier began snaking their way toward us, crawling up the sides of the RV, wrapping around it like they were trying to pull it apart. Diane grabbed my arm. "We don't have time," she said, her voice rising in panic. "I think this thing, it's tied to the land. If we can show it that we understand, that we respect it, maybe we can stop this." "Respect it?" "Diane, it just killed Lucas," I snapped, shaking my head. "How do we show respect to something that's trying to kill us too?" She didn't answer, but her eyes flicked to the artifacts and carvings we'd found earlier, now scattered across the small table in the RV. She grabbed them, Maria's notebook, the sketches of the symbols, even a small piece of bark with one of the carvings we'd taken, and shoved them into my hands. "We have to try," she said. "Try what?" I asked, but she was already out the door. I cursed under my breath and followed her, even though every part of me wanted to stay locked inside. Outside, the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and something metallic, like rust and blood. The lights swirled around us, almost blinding, and the Guardian stood just a few yards away now, staring at us. My legs felt like lead, but Diane kept moving, stepping toward the center of the clearing where we'd parked. She spread the artifacts out on the ground, arranging them in a circle, and knelt in the center. "Diane, get out of there," I shouted, but she ignored me. She started muttering under her breath, repeating the phrases and symbols she'd read in her notebook. Her voice was shaky at first but grew stronger as she went on. The Guardian tilted its head, almost like it was listening, and then the roar came again, different this time. It wasn't angry. It sounded mournful. The vines and roots froze, then began to pull back, untangling themselves from the RV and the ground around it. The lights slowed their frenzied dance, growing dimmer, softer. For a moment I thought it was working, but then the Guardian turned its glowing eyes to me. The ground beneath my feet gave way, and I fell hard. The wind knocked out of me. The vines were back, wrapping around my arms and legs, dragging me toward the creature. I struggled, but it was no use. The vines were too strong, their grip, like steel. Diane screamed, running toward me, but I shouted for her to stay back. "It's me," I yelled at the Guardian, my voice cracking. "I'm the one you want." The Guardian paused, its massive form looming over me. It leaned down, its face inches from mine, and I felt something cold and ancient crawl into my mind. It wasn't speaking, but I could feel its thoughts, its anger, its pain. This land had been its home for centuries, its sacred ground, and we, humans, had poisoned it, cut it, burned it. I'd always thought I was different, that I respected the forest, but maybe I'd been lying to myself. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I should have done more." The vines tightened, and I thought that was it, that this was how I was going to die. But then Diane's voice cut through the air, loud and clear, reciting something from her notebook. The carvings on the artifacts began to glow faintly, and the Guardian froze. Slowly, the vines loosened their grip, and I fell to the ground, gasping for air. Diane stepped forward, holding one of the glowing carvings in her hands. She placed it on the ground in front of the Guardian, bowing her head. "I understand now," she said, her voice steady. "You're not just protecting the forest, you're protecting us too. But we failed you. We disrespected you. That ends now." The Guardian didn't move for a long moment, and I thought it might attack again. But then, slowly, it straightened, its massive form blending into the shadows of the trees. The lights faded, and the forest fell silent once more. The Guardian was gone. We left the forest the next morning, though it felt like it didn't want us to go. Diane didn't say much, and neither did I. There wasn't much to say. Lucas was dead. Maria was gone. But somehow, we'd survived. When we reached the edge of the forest, Diane turned to me. "I think it let us go," she said quietly. "But it won't let anyone else come back. Not unless they're ready to respect it." I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could think about was the Guardian, its glowing eyes, its raw power, and the overwhelming feeling that it wasn't done with us yet. We drove off, leaving the Redwoods behind, but I knew I'd never really leave them. Part of me was still out there, buried in that ancient soil, watching, waiting for what I didn't know, and I knew this for sure. I would never ever go back. My name is Patricia Hawthorne, but most people call me Patty. This happened to me and my late husband Doug a few years ago in the South Dakota Badlands. Even now, I can't believe we survived as long as we did. Sometimes late at night, I still wake up to the sound of pounding drums, echoes of that nightmare we lived through. I don't know why I'm writing this, maybe to warn people, or maybe just to remind myself that it was real. Doug and I had been traveling in our old RV, a 1970 Dodge Trafco we nicknamed Bertha. She'd been with us through thick and thin, a little beaten up but reliable, until we pulled into that remote campsite in the Badlands. I remember the heat that day. The sun was blazing, and the land stretched out in front of us, dry, cracked and endless. Towering buttes and mesas stood like ancient statues watching us as we drove deeper into the wilderness. It was beautiful in a way that made you feel small, insignificant. It was Doug's idea to park out there, away from the main campground. He loved the quiet. "There's no better place to breathe," he said, leaning out of the RV window to take in the view. He was a retired rodeo champion with a knack for adventure and a stubborn streak a mile wide. He always believed he could handle anything. But I felt uneasy the moment we parked. Maybe it was the way the wind howled through the canyons, or how the silence seemed heavier than usual, like the land itself was holding its breath. Or maybe it was the old woman we met at the gas station, just before we turned onto the dirt road. She was a Lakota elder, Eleanor White Eagle, and she'd come up to us as we filled the tank. Her voice was calm, but her eyes carried the weight of something ancient. "You shouldn't go out there," she told us. "Not this time of year. The hunger season has started." Doug had smiled politely, thanked her for the advice, and kept pumping gas like she'd been talking about a weather report. But something about her words stayed with me. That first night was when it started. We had set up camp on a high flat mesa, far from anyone else. Doug made a fire, while I warmed up some canned chili on the RV's tiny stove. The sunset painted the sky in fiery oranges and purples, and for a while it felt perfect, peaceful. But as the stars came out, I began to notice something strange. The wind had died completely, leaving the air heavy and still. Then I heard the drums. Faint at first, a low, steady rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I stepped out of the RV and looked toward the horizon, nothing but shadows stretching across the land. "Do you hear that, Doug?" I whispered. "Hear what?" he asked, poking at the fire. "Drumming." He paused and cocked his head, listening. The fire popped, but the rest of the world was eerily quiet. He shrugged. "It's probably an echo off the rocks. Don't let your imagination get the better of you, Patty." I wanted to believe him, but the sound didn't go away. All night it came and went in waves, as though the land itself had a heartbeat. The next morning, we woke to find that something had changed. Doug had gone out early to stretch his legs while I made coffee, but when he came back, his face was pale. "Come see this," he said. I followed him a short distance from the RV to a nearby gully. What I saw made my stomach turn. 2 cows, or what was left of them. They were mutilated, their bodies torn apart, but left untouched by scavengers. The blood had soaked into the dry earth, and strange symbols had been carved into the hides, symbols I didn't recognize. "Coyotes?" I asked, though I knew it didn't make sense. Doug shook his head. "No, this is something else. Maybe a sick prank or something." I couldn't take my eyes off the symbols. They looked almost like arrows, pointing in different directions, each one jagged and uneven, as if they'd been scratched in desperation. By the time we got back to the RV, I was ready to leave. I told Doug it didn't feel right staying there anymore, but he brushed me off. "Patty, it's nothing," he said firmly. "We're in the middle of nowhere, probably some bored kids messing around. But how could anyone get all the way out here?" I said. "We didn't pass another car for miles." He didn't answer, just gave me that stubborn look of his, the one that said, "I'm not budging." So I dropped it, though the knot in my stomach only tightened. Later that day, things got even stranger. As we wandered the area, Doug pointed out a strange rock formation that hadn't been there the day before, a circle of stones perfectly arranged in a spiral. "Looks like some sort of ritual site," Doug joked, nudging me. But I didn't laugh. That evening, Eleanor's words came back to me as I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Asterisk, the hunger season. What had she meant? By the second night, the Badlands felt different, like the land itself was watching us. The drumming returned, louder now, and coming at intervals that made it impossible to ignore. I tried convincing myself it was all in my head, but when I glanced over at Doug by the fire, even he looked uneasy. He stared into the darkness beyond our campsite, his hand resting on the handle of his old hunting knife. "You hear it this time, don't you?" I asked quietly, careful not to spook him. He didn't answer right away, just nodded. "Yeah, I hear it." That's when we both heard it. This low, guttural howl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf, not anything I'd ever heard before. It seemed to ripple through the air, rising and falling like it was calling to something. Doug stood up, scanning the horizon. "Stay here," he said firmly. "Wait, where are you going?" I grabbed his arm, but he gently pulled free, just to check it out. "Probably some stray wildlife, that's all." I wanted to argue, but something about the way he said it stopped me. Doug had always been a man who needed to see things for himself, no matter the risk. "Be careful," I whispered. He didn't answer, just gave me a small nod, and took his flashlight. I watched him disappear into the shadows, the light from the beam slowly shrinking until it was gone entirely. I stayed close to the fire, my legs pulled up to my chest. The howling had stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. The drumming had started again, faint but steady, like it was inching closer. I tried to focus on the fire, on the crackling logs and the warmth on my face, but my ears strained against the silence, searching for any sign of Doug. Then I heard the snapping of twigs behind me. "Doug," I called, my voice trembling. No answer. For a moment, I thought I saw movement near the edge of the mesa, just beyond the firelight, but it was so quick I couldn't be sure. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood and slowly turned, clutching a stick from the fire, like it was some kind of weapon. That's when Doug came back, startling me so badly, I yelped and dropped the stick. "Whoa, it's just me," he said, holding up his hands. "Don't sneak up on me like that." I hissed, clutching my chest. "Sorry," he said, but his voice was tight, distracted. "Come here, you need to see this." He led me about a quarter-mile from the campsite, down into a shallow ravine, where the ground was softer, almost sandy. His flashlight beam landed on a rusted old truck, its paint faded, and its tires halfway sunk into the earth. "That's Johnny Miller's truck," Doug said grimly. Johnny was a young rancher we'd met in town a few days earlier. He'd told us he was heading out to the far side of the Badlands to check on his cattle, but no one had heard from him since. "Where is he?" I asked, though I wasn't sure. I wanted to know the answer. Doug shook his head. "No sign of him. But take a look at this." He pointed to the truck's door, which had been torn clean off and was lying several feet away. A deep scratch ran along the side of the truck, the kind you'd expect from a wild animal, but it didn't match any claw marks I'd ever seen. The grooves were long, uneven, and almost deliberate. Whatever did this wasn't just passing by, Doug said, a dark edge in his voice. Maybe it's time we head back to town, I suggested, suddenly feeling very small standing out there in the open. Doug hesitated. Yeah, maybe. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't argue. We made it back to the RV, just as the sun was starting to rise. I thought maybe things would feel less intense in the light of day, but if anything, the new daylight only made the growing unease worse. Later that morning, I found something that chilled me to the bone. I was wandering a little ways from the RV, trying to clear my head, when I spotted something sticking out of the dirt. At first, I thought it was a random rock or piece of trash, but when I picked it up, I realized it was an arrowhead. It was sharp, heavy, and covered in strange markings, the same jagged lines I'd seen carved into those dead cattle. There were more of them scattered in the dirt, some smaller, some larger, but all of them carried the same sinister designs. When I showed Doug, he frowned, but didn't say much. I could tell he was trying to act like it didn't mean anything, but I caught him, glancing nervously at the spiral rock formation nearby. It's just artifacts, he said, forcing a smile, probably from some old hunters or something. We're in the Badlands, after all, but I knew he didn't believe that. Not really. That afternoon, the temperature inside the RV dropped so suddenly, I could see my breath fogging in front of me. Outside, it was at least 90 degrees, the kind of heat where the ground shimmers, but inside Bertha, it felt like the middle of winter. Doug checked the thermostat, but nothing made sense. We even tried turning the heat on, but it didn't make a difference. It's just the wiring, Doug said, though his face was tight. You don't believe that? I said quietly. He didn't answer, just paced back and forth, muttering under his breath. By evening, even the wildlife had started acting strange. A group of prairie dogs had gathered near the edge of the mesa, all of them standing perfectly still, staring at us. Normally they'd scatter the second they saw a person, but these didn't move, not even when Doug yelled at them. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones, and I was starting to think Eleanor's warning wasn't just superstition. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. By the third day, neither of us could pretend anymore. Something was very, very wrong. Doug had barely spoken since we found Johnny Miller's truck. He kept himself busy, checking the RV, walking the perimeter of the campsite, as if there was anything out there he could fix. I knew that look on his face. It was the same one he used to get before a rodeo, sizing up a bull he didn't quite trust. Nervous, but trying not to show it. The drumming hadn't stopped. It came and went, sometimes faint, sometimes so loud it felt like it was coming from right under our feet. And the howls, they were closer now, louder. They didn't sound like calls to other animals anymore. They sounded like they were meant for us. Eleanor came back into my mind as I sat outside by the fire, trying to make sense of it all. Asterisk. The hunger season. What had she meant? I didn't have to wonder for long, because that afternoon she showed up. We were about to eat lunch when her old rusty pickup truck rumbled into our campsite. I spotted her wide-brimmed hat first, her long braids draped over her shoulders as she climbed out of the cab. She moved like she'd done this before, grim but steady, her soft leather shoes crunching on the gravel as she approached. "I told you not to come out here," she said simply, looking at Doug and then at me. Her voice was calm, but somehow that made it scarier, like she already knew what was coming. "What's going on, Eleanor?" Doug asked. He didn't sound as confident as usual. "There's been some weird stuff happening. Dead cattle, strange noises. What's all this about?" She let out a long sigh and sat down on one of the rocks near the fire. "You two aren't the first to see it. Won't be the last either," she said, pulling a leather pouch from her coat. She sprinkled something into the fire. It popped and crackled, and the flames turned blue for just a moment. "We've lived here our whole lives," she continued, staring into the flames. "We know this land, its stories, its rhythms, but there's a place deep in the Badlands, where none of us go, not even the animals. It's poisoned, cursed. A long time ago, something made its home there, and it's never left. We call them asterisk, the starving ones. I felt a chill run down my spine. The starving ones, I asked. She nodded. Wendigos, have you heard the stories? She asked, glancing at Doug and me. I shook my head. Doug frowned. That's just folklore, isn't it? Scary campfire tales. Eleanor's lips tightened, but she didn't argue. You can call it what you want, she said, but it's real. It always starts the same way. Drums in the distance, strange markings, the animals acting wrong. Then people go missing, and when they're found, well, sometimes they're not people anymore. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Not people anymore, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes soft but serious. The hunger changes them, twists their bodies, their minds. They stop being human. They become the starving ones, cursed to roam, always hungry, never full. That's ridiculous, Doug said, shaking his head. I don't mean to be rude, but that's a story, a legend. It's not real. Then explain what's been happening to you, she said calmly, tilting her head. Explain why Johnny Miller's truck is abandoned, why the animals won't come near, why the air itself seems wrong. Go ahead, I'll wait. Doug opened his mouth like he was going to argue, but then he closed it. He didn't have an answer. None of us did. Eleanor continued. This land you're on, it's sacred. A long time ago, my people fought to protect it, to keep the balance, but settlers came and desecrated it. They built over our burial grounds, dug into the earth without respect. The starving ones awoke in anger, and their curse spread. It's been happening ever since. Doug ran a hand over his face, frustrated. So what do we do? Just pack up and leave? He asked. Eleanor shook her head slowly. It's too late for that. They've already marked you. They've already decided. Decided what? I asked, my voice shaking. She looked at me carefully, like she was trying to choose her words. They feed on hunger, your fear, your pain, your guilt. They'll use those things to break you, to turn you. They're drawn to weakness, but they can be stopped. It won't be easy though. What do we need to do? Doug asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled a small bundle from her bag and unwrapped it. Inside was what looked like an old weathered bone knife. This, she said, is what you'll need when the time comes. It was made long ago to fight them, to send them back to where they came from. But you have to be ready to make sacrifices. Doug took the knife, turning it over in his hands. Sacrifices, he repeated. What kind of sacrifices? Eleanor didn't answer. They'll come for you soon. Stay in the RV. Stay together, and whatever you do, don't listen to the voices. They'll try to pull you out, trick you. But it's not your loved ones out there. Do you understand? We nodded, though my hands were shaking. This was insane. Wendigos, curses, voices, but I couldn't deny what I'd seen, or the feeling in my gut that she was right. Before she left, she looked at me one last time. You're stronger than you think, she said softly. Don't forget that. And then she was gone, leaving Doug and me alone, with the growing dread that night was coming again. That evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Doug found Johnny Miller's journal, stashed under the seat of his truck. It was half burned, the pages torn and stained, but the words we could make out sent a chill deeper into my bones than any cold air the RV could conjure. I'm changing, one of the entries read in shaky handwriting. I can feel it in my bones, gnawing at me. I can't stop the hunger. They're out there, waiting for me, calling my name. Soon, I won't be me anymore. When we finished reading, Doug quietly closed the journal and set it down. He didn't say a word, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The night fell quickly after that, and the Badlands went completely silent. Not even the wind dared to blow. And then, just as Eleanor had warned, the voices started calling Doug's name. That night, everything came undone. The RV felt smaller than it ever had, the thin walls doing nothing to block the cold that seemed to press in from all sides. Doug had parked Bertha, so her front faced the open Badlands, the firelight from our campsite casting long flickering shadows across the cracked earth. The drumming had started again, steady, relentless, and just like Eleanor warned, the voices followed. At first they sounded faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. Doug, it was so soft, I almost thought I imagined it. But then I saw Doug freeze. He was sitting by the little RV table, sharpening his hunting knife out of habit. His head snapped up, his hand tightening on the knife. Doug, the voice was clearer now, coming from somewhere outside. I stared at him. What is that? I whispered, though I already knew. He shook his head slowly. It sounds like Johnny, he said, his voice low and tight. Doug, help me. The voice called again, louder this time. It was Johnny's voice. There was no mistaking it. It sounded desperate, broken, like he was hurt, and barely holding on. Doug stood, grabbing his flashlight. No, I said quickly, grabbing his arm. Eleanor said this would happen. Don't listen to it. It's not real. He looked at me, torn. But what if it's him? He said. What if he's out there? Patty, alone, hurt. I can't just leave him. No, I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the terror clawing at my chest. You don't know it's him. You don't know what's out there. Please, Doug, stay here with me. The voice called again, closer now. Doug, please, you have to help me. Doug clenched his jaw, his knuckles white as he gripped the flashlight. For a moment, I thought he was going to push past me, but then the voice changed. It still sounded like Johnny, but it wasn't desperate anymore. It was mocking. Doug, we're waiting for you. Come out, cowboy. My breath caught in my throat. Doug froze. It's not him, I whispered, my voice shaking. It's not Johnny. That's when the banging started. It came from the side of the RV, hard and fast, like fists pounding metal. The whole vehicle shook, the cabinets rattling. My heart jumped into my throat as I pressed myself against the wall, glancing toward the window. Doug, let me in. The voice called again, this time right outside. The banging moved to the door, louder now. Doug grabbed his rifle and pointed it toward the noise, but his hands were trembling. My mind raced, trying to remember Eleanor's words. Don't open the door. Don't listen to the voices. Patty, Doug said suddenly, his voice sharp. Lock the bathroom door. Get in there now. No, I said, shaking my head. I'm not leaving you, Patty, he barked, his voice full of frustration and fear. But before either of us could move, we heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A low growl, deep and guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was something else entirely. Doug's eyes darted to the window, and he motioned for me to stay quiet. Slowly he reached out and turned off the RV's interior lights, plunging us into darkness. The fire outside cast just enough light for me to see his face, pale and tense. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, silent and still, listening as the growls and banging moved around the RV. I could hear scratching now, long, slow rakes of claws against metal. My hands shook as I clutched Eleanor's bone knife, the only weapon I had. Then, out of nowhere, the growling stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Doug looked at me, his eyes full of a question he didn't dare ask. Had they gone? The answer came a second later, when the entire RV lurched to the side with a loud crash. I screamed as I hit the wall, the knife flying from my hand. Doug grabbed hold of the table, trying to steady himself as the RV rocked violently, like something, or multiple things, were trying to tip it over. The windows shattered next, glass spraying across the floor as black, clawed hands reached inside, groping blindly. They were long, too long, with jagged fingers that looked like they could tear through bone. Doug aimed his rifle and fired. The deafening blast made my ears ring, but it didn't stop the hands. "They're coming through," I shouted, scrambling to grab the knife. "Get to the bedroom," Doug yelled, firing again. I stumbled toward the back of the RV, slamming the door shut behind me. My whole body was shaking as I pressed my back against the door, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. From the front of the RV, I could hear Doug shouting, firing, fighting. But then I heard something else. A low, whispering voice that seemed to come from all around me. "Patty," it said, stretching my name into a hiss. "Why are you hiding? Come outside." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. But then the voice changed. "Patty," it said again, softer now. But this time, it was my sister's voice. My sister who had passed away years ago. "Patty, it's me." "Open the door." Tears filled my eyes. "No," I whispered, "you're not her. Don't be scared. I'm here to help you," it said sweetly. I pressed my hands over my ears, shaking my head. "You're not real." The doorknob rattled, and I screamed. Before I could react, the door burst open, and Doug dove through, slamming it shut behind him. His face was scratched, his shirt torn, but he was alive. "Are you okay?" he panted, grabbing a chair to shove under the doorknob. I nodded, though my whole body was trembling. "Doug, they're inside," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I know," he said, his face grim. "We have to get out of here." "But how?" He didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the tiny bedroom window and checked outside. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the same way they always did, right before he pulled off some impossible rodeo stunt. "Follow me," he said finally, motioning for me to climb out the window. "What about the RV?" I asked. He didn't look at me as he said, "It's done, Patty. We can't stay here. Let's go." I climbed out first, landing in the dirt with a thud. Doug followed, pulling me into the shadows. The air was freezing, but sweat dripped down my back as we crouched low, scanning the area. The Wendigos were there, at least 3 of them. They moved like shadows, quick and unnatural, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. One of them turned toward the RV and let out a screech that rattled my teeth. "Run," Doug whispered, grabbing my hand. And we ran, the sound of drumming and howls growing louder behind us. We ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were about to give out, but Doug didn't let go of my hand. The drumming and howls felt like they were closing in, surrounding us. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I was sure I'd see one of those things right behind me, but all I saw was darkness. Somehow, that was worse. Doug led me down a narrow path through the gullies, the sharp rock formations on either side rising high like walls. It was darker here, the moonlight barely breaking through, and every shadow felt alive. "Where are we going?" I panted, clutching the bone knife Eleanor had given me. "There," Doug said, pointing ahead. At first I didn't see it, but then, as we climbed up a slight rise, I spotted what he was pointing at. A circle of stones at the top of a small hill, glowing faintly in the moonlight. "The burial ground," I whispered, remembering Eleanor's warning. Doug nodded. She said, "It's sacred. If anywhere's safe, it's there. Just keep moving." I didn't argue. My whole body was shaking, and my mind screamed at me to stop, to rest, but I kept going. The air grew colder as we climbed, each breath coming out in clouds of mist. My ears were ringing from the drumming, louder now than ever, but when we finally reached the top of the hill, it stopped. The silence was deafening. The circle of stones looked ancient, like they'd been there for thousands of years. Strange carvings ran along the surface of each one, glowing faintly in the pale light of the moon. In the center of the circle, the ground was bare, smooth, almost unnaturally so. Doug pulled me into the circle, his eyes scanning the darkness below. "Do you think they can't come up here?" I asked, clinging to the hope that we'd finally found safety. Doug didn't reply. He was staring out into the Badlands, his body tense. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw them. They were down there, at the base of the hill, at least a dozen of them. Their long, thin bodies moved unnaturally, like they were part shadow and part flesh, and their glowing eyes burned like embers. One of them stepped forward, larger than the rest. Its head tilted as it stared up at us, and I swear I could feel its gaze pierce right through me. "That's the Alpha," Doug said quietly, gripping his rifle tighter. "How do you know?" I whispered. "Because it's the one leading the pack," he said grimly. The Alpha raised one clawed hand, and the others began to move, creeping up the hill like predators stalking prey. "Doug, what do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the knife in my hand, then back at the burial ground. His expression hardened, and I knew he was working something out in his mind, turning over a plan he hadn't told me yet. "I'll hold them off," he said finally. "What? No." I grabbed his arm. "You can't. Listen to me, Patty." His voice was firm but calm, the way it always got when he was about to do something reckless. "This is the only way. I'll distract them, buy you enough time to figure out how to use that knife." Eleanor said, "It's the only thing that can stop them." "I don't know how to use it," I said, my voice breaking. Tears were streaming down my face, hot and fast. "I don't know what to do, Doug. Please, we can figure it out together." "There's no time," he said softly, cupping my face with one hand. "You're stronger than you think. I know you can do this." I shook my head, sobbing. "Please don't do this," I whispered. He smiled, but his eyes were full of pain. "I love you, Patty. Always." Before I could stop him, he turned and stepped out of the circle. Doug's voice rang out, loud and commanding, as he raised his rifle. "Hey, you want me? Come and get me." The Wendigos froze for a moment, their glowing eyes snapping to him. Then they moved as one, rushing toward him with horrifying speed. "No," I screamed, but Doug didn't flinch. He fired once, then twice, the gunshots echoing through the Badlands. The Alpha let out a screech that made my ears bleed, and the others scattered briefly, giving Doug enough time to grab one of the torches we'd brought from the RV. He swung it wildly, the flames casting long shadows across the hill. "Come on," he shouted again, drawing them farther away from the circle. I could only watch, frozen in horror, as the pack surrounded him. For a moment, the fire kept them at bay, but then the Alpha lunged forward, its claws slashing through the torch and sending flames scattering across the ground. Doug fell. "No," I screamed again. Something shifted inside me, then anger, fear, grief. It all boiled over until there was nothing left but determination. I tightened my grip on the bone knife and stepped into the center of the circle, where the carvings glowed brighter, almost pulsing. I didn't know what I was doing, but I felt something guiding me, like the voices of the land itself were whispering in my ear. I raised the knife high and plunged it into the ground. The moment the blade hit the earth, the carvings on the stones flared to life, glowing white-hot. A shock wave of energy rippled outward, knocking me to my knees. The Wendigos screeched in unison, their bodies convulsing as the wave hit them. One by one, they began to dissolve, their shadowy forms breaking apart like ashes in the wind. The Alpha was the last to fall. It turned its glowing eyes toward me, letting out one final bone-chilling roar before it, too, disintegrated. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the light faded, the drumming stopped, the Badlands went silent. I stumbled to where Doug had fallen, my heart breaking with every step. He was lying on his back, his chest rising and falling weakly, blood staining his shirt. "Doug," I whispered, dropping to my knees beside him. His eyes fluttered open, and he managed a weak smile. "You did it," he said, his voice barely audible. "We did it," I said, tears streaming down my face. He reached up, his hand brushing my cheek. "You're so strong, Patty." His voice trailed off, and his hand fell limp. "No, no, no," I sobbed, shaking him. "Doug, Please don't leave me. Please. But he was gone. The authorities came the next morning, called in by Eleanor, who had waited nearby. They found me sitting by Doug's body, clutching the bone knife. The government quickly declared the area restricted, covering up what had happened, just like Eleanor said they would. I never left the Badlands after that. I couldn't. It felt wrong to leave Doug, to leave the land we'd fought so hard to protect. Eleanor and I became the keepers of the burial ground, watching, guarding, making sure nothing like that ever happened again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the drums, and I wonder if they're waiting for the hunger season to come again.